define the terms, ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and a coalition force is a force constituted of military elements of nations that have organized a temporary alliance for some specific purpose. I'm going to start off this debate with a quote from the House Committee Chairman Mike Rogers about ISIS. To defeat this enemy, the U.S. will have to risk Americans who will be operating in the fight. ISIS is a brutal extremist group that is located in various areas of Iraq, Syria, and other nations in the Middle East. They're extremely dangerous and are a threat that needs to be dealt with. I think that the United States needs to lead a coalition force against ISIS because of our unique position as a world superpower. The Middle East could become destabilized, and that ISIS could pose a threat to the U.S.
Thank you, John, and I accept the terms defined by my opponent. Ladies and gentlemen, my opponent has told you that the U.S. should lead a coalition force against the religious extremist group ISIS. My opponent has told you that the U.S. has to lead this coalition force because the U.S. has a humanitarian role to play. We need to protect the regional stability in the Middle East, and ISIS poses a direct threat to the United States of America. Today, I am here to tell you that the U.S. does have a humanitarian role to play, and we are already playing that role in several other nations around the world. I'm here to tell you that the burden should not fall on the U.S. to protect the regional stability in the Middle East. And finally, I'm here to tell you that ISIS poses a threat to the U.S., but not quite the threat you think. Thank you. John?
ISIS commits horrible atrocities daily, and based on the U.S. position as a world superpower, we have a responsibility to help. According to United Nations report, from the beginning of 2014 to the end of August, 24,000 people were either killed or injured by ISIS. These numbers have risen since August, and the number of people that have been casualties as a result of ISIS should constitute U.S. assistance just by the numbers alone. In the territories controlled by ISIS, many horrible acts of violence have become the normal for the citizens living. People are forced to join ISIS and accept their extreme form of Islam or die. And many children are forced to become child soldiers for ISIS. In an interview with CBS, a doctor who could not get his name out described what it was like living in the ISIS city of Mosul. He said, "Mosul is like a big prison with limited water and no gas. Electricity comes on once only comes on once every 2 days. There is no work and a massive shortage of medicine." He also said that they control life, clothing, everything in a very harsh way, very strict punishments. Among the worst of those punishments are the max executions they hold. In an article from CBSNews.com, a survivor of ISIS named Sirin describes what it was like as a group of 100 men from his village were taken by ISIS. They told them they were going to a refugee camp, but they soon discovered they led them to a pit which would serve as a large grave. They told them to get on their backs, and they started firing their guns. Sirin was hit 3 times in the leg, and a bullet grazed his neck. He said he could not cry out, because if he did, he would be shot in the head. After ISIS left the site, Sirin was lucky enough to escape. Living under ISIS control is dangerous, violent, and downright cruel. No one should have to live like that, and the United States is responsible, as a world superpower, to stop this inhumane treatment of people by creating a coalition force and putting it into action. Thank you.
Before I begin, let me say that in no way do I condone the actions of ISIS. I find the atrocities they commit horrid, and someone needs to stop them. But I do not believe it is the U.S.'s place to lead a coalition force against ISIS. As I said in my introduction, the U.S. is already involved in several other humanitarian crises around the world, including 4 major crises involving over 60 million people worldwide. The World Health Organization has appealed to the U.S. for $14 million in aid in the Ukraine crisis, and the U.S. This is according to the WHO website, and according to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the U.S. has implemented further sanctions on Russia and continues to play a role in sanctioning Russia. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, in case you don't know, the 2 nations are essentially attacking each other with projectiles, explosive projectiles, and are causing several losses of life. The U.S. is playing a conflict management role in this crisis and is urging both sides to negotiate, according to an article by the Huffington Post. We are now also entrenched in the Ebola crisis, in case you have missed it. We have 3 cases, just in case. We have 3 cases in the U.S., 2 of which were from direct transmission, 1 of which resulted in a death, but that was from West Africa. As I said, the U.S. is in 4 major crises involving 60 million people around the world. We are a global force for good, as those Navy commercials believe. That said, we are a nation made up of humans, and we can only handle so many conflicts at once. Not to mention we have several issues of our own that bear resolving. We have an immigration issue that needs to be resolved, as well as debt we need to pay off. Don't misconstrue my words. I believe ISIS's actions are positively atrocious, but I'd also point out that the U.S. has other equally large problems. And who's to say the burden of the blame should consistently fall on the U.S. to be the big brother that always provides assistance to other countries? In an article written by Jeffrey Sachs, the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia, and this institution is dedicated to bring together people and tools needed to address the world's most difficult problems, he calls for the powerful nations in the Middle East to resolve the crisis of their own accord and demands that the U.S. request a plan for action against ISIS instead of fighting this problem single-handedly with the assistance of a few other nations. This is certainly a better alternative solution to involving ourselves in another long-term conflict, one that could potentially cost U.S. taxpayers $1.5 billion per month, according to Professor Gordon Adams, a foreign policy professor at American University, again citing a Huffington Post article. Thank you, John.
The U.S. needs to intervene with ISIS because the stability of the Middle East is at stake. The U.S. spent 10 years in Iraq and set up a fragile but functional democratic government. My opponent says that the cost of attacking ISIS may be too high, but if we don't, they can destroy the local government and all the work and sacrifices and money that was spent creating it. It would all go to waste. ISIS is primarily Sunni, and since most of the government's senior officials in Iraq's government are Shiites. ISIS is in Baghdad, Iraq's capital, and has been attacking the city with mortar fire and car bombs, according to The Guardian. If the ISIS does not form a coalition, Baghdad could be taken over. And if Baghdad is taken over, ISIS can take over Iraq's government and a lot of power with it. People have tried to stop ISIS, but they're just too powerful. In early August, according to the Washington Post, a Syrian tribe attempted to revolt against ISIS, and 700 of them were shelled, crucified, and beheaded. ISIS has erased borders in between countries and is spreading rapidly. ISIS is currently in Syria, Iraq, and a mile away from Turkey's border. And it's like a cancer, it keeps growing. And the U.S. needs to create a coalition force with other countries to stop ISIS before it becomes too large and uncontainable. Thank you.
Before I begin this article, or begin this portion of my argument, I'd like to pose to you a question. Should the U.S. actively protect nations who won't attempt to protect themselves? Now let me give you a case example of this. Turkey in the Middle East is a country who could potentially fall under attack from ISIS. At one point blank refused to participate in a coalition force against ISIS until the U.S. supports the rebels ousting Bashar al-Assad, according to a CBS article. One of the groups vying for control of Syria is, I'll give you one guess, ISIS. And they are by far considered the most powerful and influential of all the rebel groups vying for control. And supporting those rebels will then we'd basically be supporting ISIS and their power grab in the Middle East. Not to mention we have invested countless lives, troops, and other resources in the Middle East to eradicate terror, train the militaries of countries particularly afflicted by terrorist groups, and we are still heavily involved in those countries and have been for 13 years. I'd also like to point out that by involving ourselves in leading a coalition force against ISIS, there is a chance that we could do more harm than good. In the Iraq War alone, the U.S.-led coalition forces were responsible for 15,060 civilian deaths, and that is 13% of the civilian death toll in the Iraq War. Who's to say this won't happen again if we lead a coalition force against ISIS? There's always casualties. I would hate for the U.S. to do the same thing that we did in the Iraq War. My opponent has told you that we will destroy everything we have worked for if we do not fight against ISIS. Ladies and gentlemen, look around you. Our very involvement in this crisis is what caused the Islamic State to rise up. My mother always told me, when you're in a hole, stop digging. It's time for the U.S. to put down the shovel. Imagine the evil that could be created by the U.S. going back in to the Middle East and fighting ISIS, only to have another more powerful group rise up. It's a vicious cycle. When does it end? When do we stop involving ourselves in this region? When do we finally say these countries have to fend for themselves and they have to defend themselves? Thank you. John?
To prevent future terrorist attacks against Europe and potentially North America, we need to destroy ISIS before it comes too big and hard to handle. According to International Business Times in June, ISIS is worth $2 billion, making it richer than several small countries. According to CNN.com, ISIS makes $1 to $2 million a day just by selling the captured oil. If they keep this up, keep expanding by their current rate, and capture enough oil fields, the U.S. economy could be hurt by the rising oil prices and the lack of oil. And the amount of people you could arm with that money is staggering. And put those weapons into the hands of wrong people like ISIS. Those weapons could cause widespread violence on a scale few of us have ever seen before. Also with this much money, WMDs pose a threat to almost every country in the world, especially the United States. Another way ISIS is a threat to America is that according to the National Terrorism Center, 100 Americans left the country to join ISIS. Now this by itself doesn't really seem like such a bad thing, but these people are trained by ISIS to kill. And the reason is particularly dangerous because they can go into the United States without raising any type of alarm whatsoever. The International Business Times also estimates that there are 100 people who left to join ISIS from America. 40 of those have returned home probably just lurking in the background, waiting for instructions of ISIS to strike. And then they can carry out whatever ISIS has planned for them, making this a very, very dangerous situation. My opponent may say that the cost of a war may be too much, but how much would you pay to make sure an event like 9/11 or worse wouldn't happen? Thank you.
Thank you, John. As far as a threat to the U.S., I'd like to point out that the U.S. has thwarted over 50 terror plots the magnitude of 9/11 since the Twin Towers fell. This is according to Heritage.org and PhD James J. Carfano. He is a leading expert in national security in the U.S. And as far as a threat to the U.S., another war in the Middle East is a far greater threat economically to us than ISIS is militarily. From 2001 to 2014, the cost of the war on terror was roughly around $4.4 trillion. Now, this factors in several things. This is not just the amount we spent. This is the amount we spent in the war, the amount we owe, and the amount we lost not spending this money on another aspect of our economy, whether that be the economy or some other thing that deserved it. This is according to the CFRG.org. And also according to this website, the U.S. debt ceiling as of May 2013 was $16.699 trillion. Now, the cost of the Iraq War is not directly factored into the U.S. debt ceiling. That said, I'm no math major, but put 4 over 16 and you get 25%. That is how much we spent, lost, could have earned, and didn't by participating ourselves in the Middle East. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta has said, I think we're looking at a kind of 30-year war here. This is from a USA Today article. If this is accurate, do some basic mathematics. We were in Iraq for 13 years, $4.4 trillion. Divide 13 by 30, you get 2, remainder 4. You're looking at roughly around, if the costs are the same, $8.8+ trillion in costs. That's a lot of money. A lot of money we could use in other resources in other areas instead of participating in another war in the Middle East, which this coalition force could lead to. And according to Professor Netta Crawford at Brown University, she says, quote, ultimately,